All right, you curious, you courageous Herle Burly-ites. Our show today centers on the passion of my professional life, public polling. One of these days, we'll do a pod on the twin passions of my personal life, rum and the riders. However, today is not that day, Herle Burly-ites. So, today, a pollster panel and an end-of-summer conversation about the state of federal politics. Trends in the data, changes in the data, and how the parties need to be positioning themselves heading into the fall session, now only 3 weeks away. With me to have that conversation are two of the best, Frank Graves and Dan Arnold. Frank is the founder and president of EKOS Research Associates, one of the country's leading applied social researchers, and an adjunct professor at Carleton University, and maybe a small mentor of the Herle Burly. Dan began his research career at Pollara, leading projects for their biggest clients. In 2014, though, he joined the Trudeau Liberals as their lead research strategist, oversaw the party's research in the lead up to their historic third-to-first 2015 majority victory. And then he did it all again in 2019 and 2021. Dan rejoined Pollara about 20 months ago as their chief strategy officer. Hey, fellas, thanks for joining the Herle Burly today.
Thanks for having us here.
What were you going to say, Frank?
Delighted to be here.
Delighted, are you? Okay, well, delighted. You're raising the bar already. How's your summer been? Frank, how's your golf game?
It's coming around. I have a new hip and a reconstructed foot, and I can now turn. So my golf game is actually pretty good.
Right. Well, turning is important in that game, yeah.
You're supposed to be playing with me soon, so we owe me a game. Come on.
I'll see for myself. Dan, what do you spend your summer doing?
I just moved in the spring, so my summer was vacationing at the Nepean Home Depot, then the Orleans Home Depot, then the Gloucester Home Depot, and that was pretty much how my summer went.
Right. That sounds depressing. Did you have any fun?
I don't know. Like I taught myself how to build shelving. I don't know if that's fun or not. I don't think it's my calling. I'm glad I have other marketable skills, but it was interesting for a change.
Now you know it's not unskilled labor. All right. So hey, let's get into it. What is, in your view, the current state of play in between the parties federally right now? Dan, let's maybe start with you. What are you seeing out there in terms of what's your latest data telling you that the numbers are?
Yeah, I don't think things are really moving too much. I mean, Frank's going to talk about his poll that has some movement. I think the conservative vote going down, but I mean, if conservatives are down to a point where they're only leading by 14 points or 15 points, that's still like saying, Connor McDavid had a bad year last year because he only got 130 points, right? It's still a pretty good year overall, and they're in a pretty enviable position. I remember when we talked at the end of last summer, David, on this podcast. At that time, the Conservatives were up by about 10 points, and I think the last thing I said was, "Well, things can change, right?" And you quite rightly pointed out, well, they can get worse too, and they did get worse for the Liberals over the last year. If we're being honest about it, it's been 15 points kind of in the fall, maybe about an 18-point gap in the spring going on from there. So I think the Liberals have tried a few things over the past year. Objectively, I think the budget rollout was actually pretty good, but the numbers haven't really moved favorably. So really since the last fall, it's been a pretty status quo landscape right now, in my view, anyways.
Yeah. Frank,
I would agree with that, with a notable caveat that I think I've seen something moving. No, I don't. I'm confident I've seen some things moving. What it means, whether it's an ephemeral movement that'll disappear, why it's happening is another issue. But we came out with a poll last fall showing the Conservatives with a 20-point lead, which was widely pilloried and said, oh, this is crazy. And actually turned out that seems to be more or less the moving average, maybe a bit lower. And that's been sustained now for a long time. And that's pretty unprecedented. I had the Liberals down in the going into the 2015 election by almost that much, and they came back, but they weren't like an incumbent that had been around for a long time carrying the baggage that they're carrying now, which, by the way, is no means unique to Canada. Most incumbents in most of the advanced Western democracies are facing similar types of pressure. So, but I think the more interesting question is why is this happening? But at overall level, yeah, the Conservatives remain in a position, even if the movements I've seen are real, and I'm convinced they're real. The reason I'll just go why I think they're real. I have conducted 2 parallel polls over the last 2 weeks, both with large samples, both using random probability methods, one with an online probability sample, one with IBR modified to work, we think, quite well. And they produced exactly the same results, which was a 7.8-point decline in Conservative fortunes over that period, largely focused in young women, which is interesting. And I believe this might be a mirrored effect of what's going on down south, where you've seen this dramatic transformation of a race that looked like, Mr. Biden had no chance of winning, to one where there's been a tremendous, and I think that may be having some sort of a spillover effect, certainly from the demographics. Now, does it mean anything? Well, at the numbers I've got right now, the Conservatives will still be in stranglehold majority territory. But, when things change, and particularly when they change that rapidly and that clearly, and as I say, the 2 independent samples, both 2,500 cases, both random probability, carefully constructed, showing exactly, it's real. Something's happening. Is it meaningful? Don't know. But it definitely means to bear attention. Does that mean, that the Conservatives are on the skids and this is going to be, part of a decline? I have no idea, and I would certainly not go out on that limb. But I would say that if you'd asked me 3 weeks ago what do things look like, I'd say this is a stranglehold, this is done, let's just mail it in. And now I'm going, well, let's see what happens, because particularly with the demographics and some of the forces going on, and I'd really like to have some time where I'm just going to shut up, where we understand what is driving this unique, this political landscape, which looks so different from what we see in the past. Because I think the factors which are driving it are even more interesting than the results themselves, and that there's things we haven't seen in this country before.
Well, maybe we'll get into that, because the thing I want to go to next, because even your poll that showed a decline in Conservative fortunes did not show an improvement in Liberal fortunes. And I went on a rant on the curse of politics this week because I'm an old man, and that means I've seen a lot of elections. And I know that the Liberals hanging around at 23 points is an historic aberration. Like, it is an unusually low number. Like, the beatings that we've taken in the past, whether to Diefenbaker or to Mulroney, the party wasn't at 23%. At the end of 13 years of government in 2006, the party wasn't at 23%. What is driving away Liberal voters? Dan?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors, and part of it is just old age of governments. This happens when people have been in power for a long time. I think the biggest underlying factor is just this post-COVID economic malaise, and as Frank said, that's hitting other governments around the world as well too. We do regular tracking every couple of years on this middle class question at Pollara. And we did something in the winter just on optimism about the future of the middle class, which has been around 50% for the past decade. And this was the first time we'd done it since COVID. And, it was down 10 points. The share of people who think their children can grow up to have the middle class dream is down more than 10 points. I think the optimism has just been sucked out of society because we all made these sacrifices during COVID, and under this assumption that we're going to build back better and have this great, post-war society where things will be booming. And that's like, the world sucks right now. Like, it's pretty shitty, especially if you're a young person and you can't afford a house. And I think there's just a lot of frustration out there that inevitably gets taken out on governments. The interest rate hikes were a big part of that. And maybe that's something, if you look at reasons where things could improve in the next year as interest rates start to climb back down. We just actually put something out this morning at Pollara. We rolled up basically 9,000 plus cases of polling from this year so far to actually get very granular in how people's vote intents modify based on their status for mortgages. And the Liberal vote is at 28% among people who have paid off their mortgage. It's at 21% among people who are still paying down a mortgage. And if you dig even further, it's at 17% among people with a variable rate mortgage. And it's 18 to 20% among people who renewed in the past year or are renewing in the next year. Whereas people who renewed further down the line, it's at least at 23%, which is not great, but there's a factor there, right? I do think this impact of interest rates, which have hit some people obviously, and then everybody else. You go to the grocery store, and I mean, I get frustrated, and I'm not choosing between like whether or not to buy clothes for my kids and buy groceries, but I see ground meat at $8 a pound when it was $5 a pound, and I just want to punch somebody there because it pisses me off every week. And I imagine people who are scraping by, it's even more impactful for them. So I think people are just getting berated and bombarded by this cost of living malaise that is out there. Look, until that gets better, it's a tough environment, I think, for an incumbent party that's been around for a long time, that is seen as having responded pretty slowly to this crisis. I think people feel Trudeau responded well to COVID. They feel he responded well to the Trump presidency, which was a big crisis of his first mandate, and they don't feel he responded well to this crisis, which is kind of the crisis of his third mandate, right? And I think that's the big hill that they have to overcome.
Frank, it's kind of remarkable to watch these kinds of things. Why do you think Canadian voters are so much less partisan than American voters are? Because you get these wild swings. So the Conservatives have gone up, 10, 15 points from the last election, and the Liberals are down 7 points from the last election or 8 points from the last election. I mean, there's nothing that Trump could do to get less than 45% of the vote. And they're so locked in there that there's so many people that will vote for their party no matter what the circumstances are. Why are they different like that than we are? We're more promiscuous.
Well, it's differences in sort of political culture and the two-party system largely. Getting Kennedy's throw is going to give up, but we know that Americans, I don't know if this number's been updated, but there used to be 91% of Americans vote the same way last time as it did this time. In Canada, we're far more politically promiscuous. We see a lot of oscillation. The big movements in the last decade were oscillations of what we called, promiscuous progressives who were frustrated with what they saw as conservative governments under Mr. Harper, which, really weren't congenial with their values or beliefs, but nonetheless were successful. And they were thinking, okay, well, what do we do to cast around to get an alternative? So they would be moving from the NDP to the Liberals to some idea, maybe both these two can get together. So that was, but that's not the movements we're seeing today, by the way. We still have a high degree of mobility in the voters, but our data suggests that 28% of Liberal voters in the last election are now voting Conservative. That's a pretty massive and surprising movement. We do see in the most recent movements, this group of under 35 women who seem to be really share a lot of the disaffection with what's the state of the economy, how am I going to get by in the future. They moved off the Conservative because I don't think they're that congenial. Maybe it was something to do with a Kamala effect, but they moved over to the NDP, which we've seen happening, which I don't think is based on any deep conviction. We'll see where that goes. But I would like to note that, pocketbook issues, affordability are huge in Europe, America, and in Canada. But if you want to look at the forces that set this in motion, I think it was the collapse of the shared prosperity and middle class model that was so effective for so many North Americans in the last century. If I look at measures of intergenerational vertical mobility, are you making more money than your father or your mother in constant dollars than they were at your age? Well, for boomers, 70% go, yeah, I am. And then as we move to the Gen X, it drops to 50, to millennials 35, to Gen Z, it's 20%. If you ask, so they're basically the whole idea, you work hard, build a better mousetrap, you're going to get a house, you're going to retire in comfort, your kids are going to do, that's gone, it's shattered. And I think that was set in motion a lot of other factors which have produced an even stronger cultural backlash. And when we look at the key predictors right now, that's a really important one. But things like asking questions on basic child-rearing preference, which measure whether you have this type of personality outlook, which some call authoritarian, we prefer to call ordered, is incredibly predictive of what happened with Brexit, what happened in the United States with Trump. But it's also one of the best predictors of what's going on here. That's morphed recently to include an even more powerful predictor, which is the degree to which you believe things which are not true. And I'm not talking about, oh, I think the moon launch was actually faked and it happened in Las Vegas. I'm talking about the instance of people who believe governments are intentionally concealing the real numbers of deaths from vaccines. But it spills over to other areas like, the rise in forest fires is due to activist arsonists, or Russia is actually entitled to be in the Ukraine. And the power of this prediction, the number of things you believe, is astonishing how predictive it is. So it's not like, for example, if you look at my top category of people in terms of their level of disinformation, which is thankfully only about 7-10% of Canadians, 96% of them are voting Conservative or People's Party. That number for the informed is like the opposite. And you see similar differences on things like, is climate change a priority? No, 0% say that's a priority. 0% trust in government amongst the disinformed. It spills over to things like, what do you think about the Freedom Convoy, which is very tightly connected with this? Amongst Conservative supporters, 52%, I like that. I think it's a good thing. The number for Liberals is 2%. It's not higher. It's not twice as high. It's not 10. It's 26 times higher. Now, what's interesting is 48% of Conservatives, maybe erstwhile Liberals that have migrated there, actually don't believe this. And I think one of the internal tensions and possible challenges for Mr. Poilievre remains he's got a large group of voters out there who are not particularly disinformed, not that mistrustful, believe in climate change, and they're kind of holding their nose due to regime fatigue or antipathy to Mr. Trudeau. But whether or not that collides with, this sort of recognition that what parade am I joining here? And I think that's something that will be worth watching, because it could actually maybe alter this outcome. But this is not business as usual. Look, I have tracked indicators like attachment to country. Is the external world getting safer or more dangerous? Yeah. What do you think? You're going to be better off 5 years from now or worse off? What do you think about, are there too many immigrants in the country? I'm seeing numbers I haven't seen ever, like in 35 years. And they're all unremittingly worse and in a region I haven't seen. And by the way, the only thing we take some comfort is, well, maybe it's a bit worse in the United States. Maybe, not that much. Maybe it's a bit worse in Europe. This kind of postmodern malaise is not business as usual. This is something that occurs like once a century, once every 50 years. And I think we should be alert to this, that stakes are not just the business as usual responses.
Welcome to week 8 of our Summer of Fascinating and Very Useful Tech series. Has it been the summer lounging listen you were hoping for? Did our little quantum computing primer from a couple of weeks back mix well with your gin and tonic? Hope so. On behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS, we press on. This week we're talking ORAN, short for Open Radio Access Network. Now that's an acronym I can get my head around, Herle Burly-ites. Lots of reasons why. ORAN is a new approach to building and managing wireless networks using open standards, open hardware, and software. Open means just what it sounds like. It allows different parts of the network to come from various companies and still work together seamlessly. Right now, there are only 3 vendors who control 77% of the global market share of traditional closed radio access networks. Just 2 vendors have 75% share in North America. Open RAN is poised to disrupt that hegemony and diversify the ecosystem, driving innovation and unlocking new possibilities. Expectations are by 2028, ORAN will account for 25% of worldwide RAN revenues. And if Canada captures 10% of the global ORAN market by 2030, it could generate approximately $3 billion annually. Underneath those raw numbers, meaningful human impact. ORAN will create jobs, foster entrepreneurship, attract more investment to the telecom sector, and ultimately build better, more resilient networks. It works like this. When different equipment from various vendors works together, it makes a network more flexible and adaptable. That leads directly to better connectivity, and better connectivity leads to all kinds of good stuff. Access to healthcare and education, the ability to do more business, safer, more vibrant communities. The list goes on, and so will we next week. You have a take on that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there. I'd say there definitely is a growing. Well, I mean, look, you're right off the start in the sense that Canadian politics are a lot more fluid than American politics. I mean, we're all going bananas because Kamala Harris is up 3 points in the polls or 4 points in the polls, and this is earth-shattering in the scheme of things there. So I think, just because of the two-party system, it just seems more entrenched there. And, it kind of pulls the parties to the polls, and that leaves it harder for people to make big inroads, whereas Canada has a bit more of a history of that. Though I think Frank is right in the sense that there are certain aspects of our politics that have grown more polarized in Canada. I think about just the media ecosystem, I think, is having an impact on this. We've been putting out an annual trust in media survey at Pollara as well too, and we are seeing a growing partisan divide in terms of trust in mainstream media outlets, with conservative voters being less trusting of not just the CBC. That's the biggest gap, obviously, in terms of trust, but even CTV, Globe and Mail, other mainstream outlets. Even the Weather Network is trusted less by conservatives compared to Liberals and New Democrats. And I think as further right-wing voters who are distrusting of the mainstream media look for alternatives, and there are a lot of alternatives out there these days, and they get reinforced by algorithms and social media ecosystems. I think that does pull at least a portion of the electorate further away from the mainstream. And I think that creates a bit of an internal pressure for the Conservatives, as every now and then they need to feed the monster and throw some comments out about the World Economic Forum, or whatever it is, to keep that monster happy. And I think for the most part, Poilievre is tried to stay on the mainstream, but it is that internal pressure that is going to continue to pull him because of
he's in the mainstream, Dan. He's in the mainstream, but he's not running the kind of campaign that, for instance, people who supported Jean Charest thought the Conservatives should run, which is hewing pretty close to the center, reassuring people on social programs, reassuring people on climate, reassuring people on gun ownership. He's not doing any of that. He's running a conservative campaign. It's not like the campaign O'Toole tried to run, and it's not like the campaign, say, Mulroney ran, or even Harper in 2005. It's more overtly conservative, and it's being very successful. What do you read into that?
Yeah, I think he's picked the parts of the conservative message that are going to have the largest resonance. So it's not like past conservative leaders have talked about tax cuts before, but I think he's made this obviously the focus. Like, go after the carbon tax. Talk about the things that are more going to be aligned with the broader public, that the base will like, but also are going to find a large degree of resonance there, and largely shut up about the other things. He's not repudiated. He hasn't tried to necessarily water down his positions, but he is talking about the parts that are going to have the larger, mainstream appeal. And I mean, look, as liberals, as a liberal, I like to think that a lot of what the Liberals stand for is stuff that is resonant with the broader public, but we have to be real about the situation. Like, on issues like crime, on taxation, like, the Conservatives are the mainstream, right? And that's what he is focusing on, because their positions are things that are pretty popular with the broader public.
Right.
Yeah.
Frank, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I agree with all that, but I don't think, unless you really look at this, at a level which is hard to follow and which most people aren't, that we really truly understand the threat that disinformation and polarization are posing for our country and other advanced Western economies. I'll give you, again, I'll just go to some of the numbers. Like, in the early stages of the Ukraine war, we asked questions about what Canadians should be doing, okay? And we had a list of 6 things that we put on the agenda, from raising to lethal to non-lethal aid. And, Canadians were widely supportive of, helping Ukraine, okay? And I said, let's just break this down with whether you've been vaccinated or not. What should that have to do with this? And so for the 90% of Canadians that have been vaccinated, the incidence of those who said we shouldn't do any of these 6 choices was 2%. When we asked out of the 10% who had not been vaccinated, that number wasn't a bit higher. It wasn't twice as high. It was 26 times higher. It was 52%. I talked to colleagues that I operate in a network in Europe who study Russian interference in elections, And they said, oh, this is part of a 5-point plan that Russia had been spinning out. They didn't bother with the French election. And it was extremely effective. But then it gets reinforced and echoed back in the North American disinformation ecosystem. And it's not just that trust in media has declined. It has precipitously, particularly mainstream media, but if you want to reach, say, this group of disinformed young men who are incredibly angry, they're on YouTube every day. And I was shocked by these numbers. And they're receiving algorithm-driven disinformation that leads them to believe, a radicalized and disconnected view. Give you a quick example. You would think that support for climate change, which is an important issue, not a pinnacle issue, but a penultimate issue for Canadians, would have gone up given what we've seen going on with, flooding and forest fires and record global temperature. It's actually gone down. But if you were to separate the 60% of Canadians who are informed, it's gone up. What's happened is for the remaining, it's gone from not being, I'm sort of skeptical of that. I'd like to do that, but I live in Alberta. No, it's now fake news. It doesn't exist. They didn't wake up one morning and go, I think there's activists out there lighting fires in the forest. This was part of a disinformation system, a more extreme version of the Taylor Green, Jewish space laser stuff. But it has effects, and they're growing. The numbers aren't going down, they're going up. Anyway, by the way, the CBC is a great one. If I was the Liberals or the NDP or some blend thereof, I'd be going after the CBC issue because it remains the most trusted news institution in the country. It's tied in Quebec by a large margin over these other sources. And most people think, why don't we fortify our ability to deal with this information, giving the CBC, for example, a mandate to address this, which would drive the Conservatives and Mr. Poilievre crazy. It has huge support. And, this, I think, would be one of those potential wedge issues, which actually might coincide with good policy that would actually maybe move the yardsticks. So, but I hear nothing in terms of big policy ideas that are really, you could argue that there were some contained in the budget. I wouldn't have talked about capital gains. I would have talked about wealth tax, the support for wealth taxes in Canada. And they'll say, well, capital gains is a wealth tax, but people didn't get it. They thought about, what about doctors or people selling their cottages? The support for a wealth tax in Canada is like 80%, and about anybody who's going to think of voting Liberal.
Yeah, but defining the wealthy is a bit tricky. I want to get back to climate.
We talk about centimillionaires. We talk about people who have more than $100 million. Okay. And we talk about corporate.
Right, that's not who the capital gains applied to.
Yeah,
right. So it's not an apples to apples.
It should have been much more circumscribed. We're going to go after, there's 58 billionaires in Canada, and then there's probably about 500 centimillionaires, and we're going to give them. They're going to pay a bigger share as our corporation. Hugely popular, and then we're going to put it into things like national projects to rebuild our hydroelectric corridor, which needs to be done anyway.
Folks, Canada has been slow walking all summer toward a shutdown of rail service. And it's almost here, like right now, this week. Both our sponsor, CN, and its main competitor, CPKC, have been at the bargaining table since last November. Talks have gone nowhere. And a severe gut punch to the economy is about to happen. Let's talk about what a full shutdown of rail service will mean to this country. CN directly supports about 100,000 jobs in Canada, not just its own railroaders, but all the employees of all the companies that supply the railway. That's a big number. Now add on the workforces of industries that rely on rail, employees at ports, on assembly lines, farmers, forestry, mining and factory workers. The list goes on. Just about everything travels by rail. You get the idea. If there is a shutdown, incoming containers at seaports will stack up. Grain won't be loaded onto outgoing ships. Auto plants will start shutting down. Consumer goods, perishables, critical medical equipment, manufactured products, they all move by train. How will this affect Canadians? Well, think back to COVID. The shortages, the empty spaces on shelves, the inflation. The fact is, CN has a record of labor peace. Since January, the company has made 4 offers. They're all posted on CN's website. The union has rejected all 4 without any counteroffer. That's a fact. CN believes the best agreement is a negotiated agreement. but you cannot negotiate when the other side doesn't show up at the table. That's a reality. Admitting facts and realities is not anti-union. But time is running out. Already, both railways have stopped accepting certain shipments that for safety reasons cannot be left stranded in the event of a shutdown. And we haven't even talked here about the impact on Canadians who commute by rail. In any case, CN believes it is now time for the federal government to intervene. The alternative, which will happen at 1 minute after midnight on August 22nd, is simply in no Canadian's interest. Dan, climate. Frank's running around the bases there, but climate. I don't believe, Frank, that concern about climate is going up in any segment of the population, because my polling indicates that the ass is completely out of that issue as a public issue. I recently did some polling where I asked my respondents to do paired choices between, and one of the options was further reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Canada that cause climate change. It lost to everything I paired it against. Right? So and when you look at voter distinctions, it's super clear that the remaining people voting for the Liberal Party care about climate change way more than all the people that are not voting for the Liberal Party do. So how much is the government's focus on this issue part of its problem?
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's not there. Some people don't care about the environment, but like if you're prioritizing the cost of filling up your gas tank versus the environment, it's going to lose every time. And even on, like, I did a profile recently of different generations in terms of what priorities matter to them. The group that cares most about climate change right now is actually boomers and silent generation, because they're not worried about paying their mortgage, so they can actually afford to maybe care a little bit more about the environment. But you look at millennial women, climate change is even in the top 8 or 9 priorities for them. It's interest rates, it's inflation, it's housing, it's the economy, it's all these other things. So, I think anytime a government is seen to be misaligned on their priorities with the public, that's always a problem. In the Liberals' defense, I don't think they've talked a lot this year about climate change, but I think a lot of what they've done previously is part of the brand, and the brand around Trudeau is things like identity issues and climate change, which was great in 2015. All those millennial women who voted for him in 2015 were pretty excited at the time that this is what his priorities were and this is what his values were. And that's just, the world has changed since then. And, that image they have of this government, I don't think has changed. And Pierre Poilievre, every time he gets up, it's axe the tax, axe the tax, axe the tax. Like, he's on brand, and he is aligned with what Canadians are thinking about right now. And anytime you see one leader who you think shares your values, or is he's talking about the things that matter to you, that's a big advantage.
Right. But could I have a quick, I agree with that, but I'd like to kind of make a couple of points that I think get lost. I think some of it, I think young people, particularly young women, are concerned about climate change and do see the havoc that's going on. I do think the issue has dropped overall. I agree with you, David. But I think it's more of frustration that the instruments, the policy instruments that have been chosen to deal with this are not transparent or compelling. So people say, I think most economists, the carbon tax is probably a good idea or some variation on that. But good luck explaining that to people. And,
well, if you have a policy in place for a decade, and at the end of that decade, the problem is worse than it was when you started, people are going to start to question that policy, right?
Correct. So we have a goal to have everybody in an electric car by 2035. There's no chance we can reach that goal with our current hydroelectric corridor. And it's going to take $2 trillion to fix that. That's not money we're going to spend going to Vegas for the weekend. It has to be done. You move the jobs, great jobs into Canada. You move the tangible benefits into Canada rather than some island that we might know about in the Pacific is going to go under. You make it much more direct and visceral. Now, I want to give you one statistic, which I find surprising amongst all the dark ones, is I've tracked for a long time a number of questions about what you see as, would you like bigger government, smaller government, in what areas, the trade-off analysis you do, which I'm a huge fan of. But I have one question that says, would you like a smaller government with lower taxes and less services, or a bigger government with more taxes and more services? Now, that question clearly favors smaller government, okay? It's set up to do so. And if I asked that question at the beginning of this century, it was 3-1. I'd like a smaller government with lower taxes. For the first time, a few months ago, that number crossed over into equal numbers, saying I'd like a bigger government with undefined more services than a smaller government with less taxes. But look what, for millennials, it was 2-1. 60-30. I'd like a bigger government with undefined more services, because you know what? They have no confidence in the corporate sector. They have no confidence in politicians, but they still believe that an active government might be able to intervene and make their lives and future better. But we're not really effectively playing that card, I don't think. And that was the card I think that that Biden was trying to play. We'll see where Kamala goes with that. But they were talking about a program which would have directed $4.8 trillion into the kinds of projects we're talking about here. I think an idea like that, particularly if it mirrors one going on in the United States, would have enormous resonance. And by the way, it's something Mr. Poilievre can't go there. He's not going, oh, we need like massive government investment in a hydroelectric corp. He's not going to go there because that's anathema to his core beliefs about the role of the state. And I think that this is an idea which is tremendously congenial with that millennial group who've been lost to the Liberals for a long time. They're not coming back anytime soon. Maybe something like this would be a magnet. I don't know. But I think it's time to try something that really actually, where there's some evidence to show this might change the current picture, which is, you know, clearly the current picture, even with, okay, they've gone down 8 points, big deal. They're on a clear path to a majority government.
You know, Dan, Frank said something there about that desire for big government or more services. And I have to say, in a lot of the polling I've done, with the exception of the fact that people are feeling crushed by the affordability crisis and therefore have a really strong desire for tax relief, with the exception of that, I don't see a remarkably more conservative country than I've been seeing in polling for years. I still see a big desire among Canadians to solve big social problems. I see real concern about the level of poverty that exists in the country, all those kinds of things. And it makes me wonder in political terms why all Liberal losses have gone to the Conservatives, why the NDP have been unable to make a counter argument to people that are unhappy about the current circumstance that moving left is better than moving right.
Yeah, it is really interesting because you would, you know, just on, you know, you ask second choice questions and things like that. And usually the second choice of Liberals is the NDP. So, you know, if there was just general like malaise with like these guys have been around too long, or I'm sick of Trudeau's face, but people were happy with the direction of the government and the issue set and all of that, you think there'd be some drifting to the NDP that would come from there. But yeah, like it's been the Conservatives that have shot up over the last year. I think what's happened really is not so much that what people believe has changed. And, you know, I said like climate change is down as a priority, but if you ask people for, you know, values questions around the environment, and like that hasn't really changed. It's still important, and it's just less important because other things have risen ahead of it. If you had to make trade-offs, if you had to make choices, it moves down the list. And that's the same thing on, you know, issues around gender and Indigenous reconciliation. Like, not that people don't care about these things, but they move down the list faced with more imminent and direct priorities. So I wouldn't say it's a more conservative country, but, you know, in political campaign terms, like what's changed is like the ballot question has just shifted in the sense that what people are basing their issues around affordability, around taxation, the economy, and, you know, a ballot question that is around economic issues is always better for the Conservatives, and it's certainly better for Poilievre in this environment, just based on his background, what he's talked about. And, you know, if the ballot question in the next year were to shift to health, entire country burned to the ground, and people suddenly, you know, rose climate change up again on their priority list, like that would benefit the Liberals and the NDP, I think. But yeah, when we're in a spot where the thing that people are basing their vote on is affordability, you know, that's just moving them to Poilievre's tent, even if their values haven't changed dramatically.
But it's interesting that marginalized people are not looking to government to fix their problem for them particularly. Because Poilievre's making no commitment to directly solve their problem. He's saying he'll create a different system in which people will be able to flourish. But if you're looking for cash tomorrow, other than axing the carbon tax, you're not going to get any from him.
the marginalized people, the economically vulnerable, are the prime targets of disinformation, and they're the most fertile marketplace for sowing disinformation. So and that does not mean that you can't then go, well, you're just being stupid or silly, or you're deplorable, or you're a fringe, because that actually just adds further emotional fuel to the fire. It's a mistake. But I think we need to understand and have a way of responding that recognizes that the game has changed, that this is not business as usual. I would like to point out one thing which I think gets lost in this sort of retrospective of, wow, boy, we spent so much during the pandemic, and that was really a shame, and blah, blah, and now that's caused inflation. Most people don't think that, okay? There were other factors that produced the inflationary rise, and so on and so forth. But I want to point out that trust in government after the first year one of the pandemic, where government was more active and more responsive and more agile than it had ever been, perhaps since the wartime. It rolled out vaccines, it had CERB, it had CEWS. Trust in government reached a 30-year high. And that was even higher amongst young Canadians. So you have to wonder if maybe we're missing a big idea here, is that active government, not building big government, but investing in things which the private sector is not going to do for you, and you can't do yourself, isn't an idea which should be looked at a lot more carefully if you want to disrupt the current sort of political status quo.
Right. Stick with you, Frank, for a second. Dan mentioned the budget. I want to get back to the sort of a little focus on the political parties here for a second. Dan mentioned the budget. And the budget was full of items that, if you test them individually, are popular. And the government's agenda is full of things that, if you test them individually, are popular. School food is a popular idea. Pharmacare is a popular idea. Dental care is a popular idea. These are all popular ideas. They rolled it out with a professionalism that everybody admired. It looked like a coherent plan to roll out that budget and sell it and inform people on it. And it didn't move the dial forward an iota. It may have moved the dial backward. What do you read into that about the fortunes of the Liberal Party?
Just a quick note, and I'll turn over to Dan because he knows more about this than I do. But we polled after the budget and asked people, what do you think of the budget? And the marks were lukewarm, probably not. They weren't good at all. They were okay. But then we said, the basic framing, the idea that we're going to tax the rich and use those funds to invest in priorities like housing or other things. What do you think of that? I think that's great. Do you think the government went far enough, did about the right balance, or fell short of that? Huge majorities, they didn't go far enough. And that's particularly pronounced in under 35 Canada. So if the budget, which I agree with all it was very professional, well rolled out, but I don't think it penetrated the noise floor and had enough bang to really kind of penetrate this kind of trench cynicism out there. You needed something which was black and white, clear. Here's the big things we're going to do to make sure that your life is going to be better in the future. And you can aspire to the idea that you can have a house or do better than your parents and all those things which your parents took for granted, or your grandparents now. So I think it was a failure of maybe not going far enough and not packaging it in bold enough terms. Because the basic idea, the logic, was highly resonant. But then it got lost in the kind of argument about, well, what about doctors, and what about, cottages, and and the chamber going in with 20%, and the real number was 1.5%. Once it gets into that noise level, whatever the point they were trying to make is lost in the wind.
Yeah. So what do you think, Dan? Is it a function of not going big enough to make their point, or is it a factor that people actually aren't open to listening to the government anymore?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I think, again, from a tactics communications perspective, it was quite well done in terms of the way that it was communicated. So I don't think you can just pass this off to saying well, no one pays attention. People at least understood that there was the capital gains measure in there. They at least understood there was a housing focus in there. The challenge might be what you were just talking about, previously, about this immediacy of things, right? Where it's great that the Liberals were focused on housing, but that's not going to help me tomorrow. Maybe this will mean houses built in 10 years. I don't know. Like it's something down the line. And, if people don't see that immediate help coming their way, it's hard for them to be motivated enough to want to change their vote based on that, unless it's something that they know is going to help them. And the things that have had an immediate impact, like dental care, that is helping the older Canadians, which, as we said, are actually pretty positive towards the Liberals these days. And maybe that has helped them with some of these older demographics and why their vote numbers are actually quite high. I think Frank had the Liberals leading among seniors in his poll that he put out recently. And, other polling I've seen, at least among older women, would have the Liberals still in pretty good shape there. So, the people who are getting helped in the short term maybe are responding to that. But, housing is just a tough issue because, you get blamed for it and there's no real way to fix it. At least certainly not before the next election campaign, right? So, that's a challenge around that issue.
Well, the politics of actually making housing affordable is actually terrible in the short term, because if you actually diminished significantly enough the equity that current homeowners are having in their homes to make it affordable for young people, you'd have a different kind of political crisis on your hands.
That is true.
That is true, but people don't know this, and I don't make a big deal of it, but EKOS is actually, the word means house in Greek, because that's what we did in our first 10 years. Our main clients were CMHC and housing clients. And you know what? At that time, CMHC wasn't just a lending organization or someone that oversaw finance. They built a whole lot of stuff. They built co-op, nonprofit, social housing. Guess what? Didn't add to the debt because it was something that was an asset. And it worked really well. And remember, we had a massive number of people came back from the Second World War, needed houses. Maybe we need to restoke some of those old ideas and have kind of our Marshall Plan for the 21st century that's going to direct funds. And where we're going to find the funds? Well, we're going to tax these really rich people who have gone and accelerated away from the pack in ways that is obscene and not even recognized. Or corporations. Remember that when GDPs were growing at a rate of 6% and compounding annually, as they were for that period from the New Deal till the end of the 70s, marginal tax rates were 90% in the United States, 80%. Now, a lot of cheating going on. There's some other differences, but still, and corporate taxes were in the 50, 60%, not 15%. And it worked fine. So the idea that you can't have high tax regimes and healthy, prosperous economies that generate shared prosperity is nonsense. You absolutely can. Anyway. And by the way, if you're looking for something to get out of the mess, you need a big idea. It's not going to be like, oh, this is really clever. Let's tweak this idea. Or you need something pyrotechnic, big, clear, bold, fully costed, that's going to grab the attention of people and go, that's a good idea. And the other guys can't go down that road, but I like that. And I'm going to see something happening on that immediately, or at least in the very near future, with clear commitments in terms of the dollars you're talking about.
All right, Dan, I'm going to put you on the spot. If your job was to get the Liberal Party back to 30 points, would you unveil a big new policy like Frank suggested, or would you change the leader?
Well, is the job to get the party back to 30 points tomorrow or in the next election campaign? I guess on election day is the question, right? Because, I think, a leadership change could have an immediate impact, and it has in the States, obviously, like in the short term. But I don't know if that would fundamentally change the underlying issues we spent the last 30 minutes talking about here around, the government's agenda, around people's frustrations with the economy, around people's frustrations on the housing market and cost of living and all these other things there. And then, $10 million of conservative advertising later, we could be back in the same position. So, I think the Liberals need to do something, regardless of who the leader is, to shift the ballot question away from where it is right now. And, that could be something big on healthcare. It could be something else. The problem with big ideas is that, again, it's a big idea that's implemented quickly, that doesn't cost a lot of money, that everyone loves, probably would have been done by now, right? So I don't know what the big idea is necessarily, but I think there are some underlying things that need to change beyond just, a leadership question. Okay.
Well, I'll stick with you for a second. I believe that the Liberals have believed for a long time that with Poilievre, familiarity would breed contempt among Canadians. that as they got to know him, they wouldn't like him. But the reverse appears to be true, that as his familiarity grows, comfort level with him grows also. I wouldn't suggest there's Poilievre mania in the country, but there's Poilievre comfort, I think, in the country. So what is the opportunity there with Poilievre? Do you think he remains a vulnerability for the Conservatives, or is he a strength for the Conservatives?
Yeah, I think at the very least, I think the Liberals need to find a way to make him a vulnerability, because any government going for a fourth mandate is going to have a tough time unless people are scared of the opposition, of the alternative. And I think the Liberals need to find a way to make him a vulnerability if he's not a vulnerability today. And that would be true of any leader, I guess, that was leading the Conservatives right now. They'd have to find a way to do that. I still think it's got to be something where you say, like, he is going to tangibly hurt you, make your life worse in some capacity. As I've talked about before, I think, some of the musings he's made around, like, rolling back CPP increases, like, feel like something, at least again with older demographics, that could scare them. What's the thing that's going to scare younger people about him from a policy perspective? Maybe it's cuts to certain programs or services. Maybe it is more, values questions, or just other far right positions he has. But there has to be something scary that's put in the window to make him unacceptable.
Right. Frank, one of the things the Liberals seem to think that might be, based on what they talk about on social media and in other circumstances, is his association with what some people would consider to be extremist groups or far right-wing groups in Canada. His caucus is willing just to meet with some people, his meeting with Diagolon or whatever that is. Yeah, various things.
By the fact that he talked about them in a release 2 years earlier. No, I think actually, if you look at that, yes, I do think that's an exposure. And I think that's more.
But does anybody know? Like, I don't know who these groups or people are. Does anybody in Canada know who these people are?
People know, for example, as I mentioned earlier, 2% of Liberals supported the Freedom Convoy. That number is 52% amongst Conservatives. Right. But that leaves 48% of Conservatives that didn't. And I think that group is probably, ignoring or willfully kind of not thinking about those internal tensions. And I think they need to be raised more clearly. But I think that, I believe that the issue of framing can be a pivotal question in winning or losing elections. And if you ask me what the Liberals are doing in terms of framing, apart from some scattergun stuff on social media, I haven't got a clue. And that's shameful. I mean, you need to say, what are the three emotionally resonant ingredients of a frame for Mr. Poilievre? And that has to be tested using, hard random controlled assignment testing, as it's done in the past. And is it, for example, serial mendacity? Okay. So he gets up and says things like, I don't know who died. Well, no, that's just not true. And this is part of a whole pile of things you said that are just not true. Is that something to be resonant? Is it a question of judgment? You like Brexit. You thought that was a good idea. You thought that we should sack the governor of the Bank of Canada and that we should have, Bitcoin. I don't know which one of these pieces can be woven into the three ingredients or two ingredients that you can put on a bloody bumper sticker and it's repeatable and emotionally resonant, but I haven't seen it and it's getting pretty darn late. Now, I think that's just part of the solution. The other is you're going to need a big idea or a series of big ideas, some national projects which will rebuild a hopeful future for Canadians, and with a clear, and you're not going to find any cost-free ones. That isn't. It's going to cost a lot of money, but let's find the money because we know where that can come from. The same places like the $4.8 trillion that Biden, and she's going to inherit and even perhaps magnify that, I think, and it's going to be, I think, probably quite successful. That is even more resonant in Canada.
But don't these things, Frank, only come into play if you've got more parity between the two parties on standard of living and cost of living economy? Like, as long as people think that this government's making their standard of living worse through things like the carbon tax, whatever, whether true or not, as long as people believe that under this government their standard of living is getting worse and Poilievre will do better at that, will anything else really matter?
Well, no, it has to come back to that it has to eventually say, I'm going to make your economic future more secure. You can once more think about a future with hope. But I think there are some strategies that we just talked about that could actually provide that, but they would have to be much bolder and they'd have to be much more definitive than what we're seeing so far. By the way, I don't think the Liberals on their own can pull this off. I think they have to signal to the electorate that just as they had a supply arrangement with the NDP that brought some of these good things that actually people did support, this is going to be part and parcel of what we're going to offer in the future. And it doesn't have to be a coalition, but some tacit and rare. And what would be a better way? The NDP ran on a wealth tax last time, and they ran, but nobody listened because the NDP weren't going to form government. But if they kind of harmonize that and note it, by the way, that's going on in the United States too. So if you're worried about a big capital flight to the United States, that our snowboard kings are going to go down there because their second jet is not been cleaned properly, then that's going to be minimized because they're not going to have that many options if the United States is going down this path, which I think they clearly will if she's successful. I think she is going to be successful. By the way, Dan, the margin is not just a couple of points right now. The margin's now expanding up to 5 and 6 points, particularly in some of these swing states. I listened to a presentation from the Democratic polling team, and they said they'd never seen such a transformation. They said every one of our polls in 2020, Biden was never behind. He was never ahead. He was headed for a loss. The transformation that we've seen in such a short period of time, coupled with the fundraising efforts and all this other stuff, I think she's going to win. And I think that tying not explicitly, but tacitly tying our horse to that wagon is a good idea. And wealth taxes would be one example of that.
It's amazing how exciting a 59-year-old looks when compared to an 81-year-old as the predecessor.
Last question I want you guys to riddle me through is this. There is some polling that indicates that there is no gender gap in voting preference right now, that women are as likely to support the Conservatives as men are. And if that's true, that would be an historic aberration. That would be an anomaly. Not just in Canada, but in Western democracies writ large. So is that the case? And if so, why?
Well, let me jump in on this because I've been thinking about it, and that's not what I'm finding. I find there's a profound gender gap, particularly with under 35 Canada. Young men, they love the Conservatives, they're wired in. Young women are very uncertain, and in my most recent poll, I had a 24-point decline. Now, it's only 100 cases, so the margin of error is, 7 or 8%, but it's still significant at 0.00.
Something happened, yeah.
Yeah, now, here's something to think about. How could you have all the polls kind of missing what's going on with young Canada and young women and so forth? There are some reasons to be suspicious of some of the results we're seeing from media polling in particular on younger Canadians. I think about, I presented at a conference in Washington in March where Pew presented in the opening session. I was on that too. And they presented the results of a research that looked at some study that YouGov had done suggesting that 28% of American youth thought were Holocaust deniers. Pew said that didn't line up with what they saw, so they did a fairly intensive study with 3 probability approaches and 3 non-probability, and they didn't reproduce it. But it gets better still. They asked questions like, are you licensed to operate a G-87 nuclear submarine? 12% of the young people in the opt-in panels, yeah, I'm licensed to operate a nuclear submarine. I think we have to be very mindful. Some of this doesn't matter when you're kind of putting all this together into big pictures and looking at voter intention, but when you're trying to narrowcast, particularly into groups like Hispanics or young people or visible minorities and so forth, these problems are quite acute, and they're much more difficult to get the data in a fashion that they're actually going to get you real people, which is scientifically accurate. So that's my little methodological rant.
Right. Dan, what do you think is going on with female voters in the country?
Yeah, and again, I don't think there's any kind of shift in values or anything like that. Because if you look at provincial polls for provinces that are heading into elections this fall, I've done some polling in BC, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick. The Conservative option there is still much stronger among men than women. So I think, any kind of federal narrowing of the gender gap that we would be seeing is being driven more by dynamics and feelings towards the Liberals and the Trudeau government that's going on there. On that big poll, roll up that we did earlier this year, and that generational analysis, again, which had a lot of cases, almost 10,000 cases behind it. I still saw, I'd say, at least a 5 to 10 point gender gap with most generations for the Conservatives, in that they're doing better among men still. However, there was no gender gap among millennials. The Conservatives were over 40% among both millennial men and millennial women, which again is just insane when you think about the history of Conservatives with millennial women. Like, this is not a group that, this is the group that was out protesting against Stephen Harper and just wanted him gone. And certainly we're not embracing any of the other Conservative options there. And, these are the generations that are really the most impacted by the housing market, by the cost of living pressures. Millennial women are the group that are the most concerned about housing, that are the most stressed about interest rates. So I think just the weight of all those pressures has let the Conservatives make some big inroads among those, I guess, what are now middle-aged demographics of millennial women, Gen X women, who are just facing these big economic pressures, and that has let them, I think, make some pretty big inroads there. They're still going to do better with men. I can't imagine any world where the Conservatives, aren't doing at least 5 points better among men than women overall. But I mean, if they're at 40% among millennial women, I think that is insane, and that is almost unstoppable from a just coalition building perspective, because they're still going to get the old guys to vote for them, and they're going to allow the frustrated young guys are going to vote for them. So those are votes that have to get shaken off in some capacity.
So if you were running Liberal strategy, that's where you'd start, right? Women.
Yeah, I think you have to shake that down. I think older women are currently feeling pretty good about the Liberals, and that's a good starting point. But I think you've got to at least make some inroads. Like we had in that polling roll up, which is again a couple months old, so maybe things have changed. And Frank's data, like Fox Mulder, I want to believe there has been some changes in the data there. But at least from like the first part of this year, Liberals were at 16% among millennial women, 17% among Gen Z women on our polling, and maybe those groups are gone, like in the sense that they're not going to be won by the Liberals in the next election campaign, but they at least have to narrow the gap and skate to a draw there, and then hope the older women are the ones that turn out and vote on election day. Frank,
I saw your poll. Among the youngest age cohort, you didn't find any Liberals at all.
No, and this is, but I haven't seen any support in the last 2 years, so this isn't new. They're just getting killed with Young Canada, but I do see a real movement with young women. And by the way, to understand why and how you might penetrate some of this, because I think that's a prime opportunity. And again, it has to be signaled that it's maybe you're not just going to get a Liberal government, you're going to get a government of the Liberals with the NDP, or because they seem to be far more likely to fall into the NDP orbit than they are into the Liberal orbit. But that group is clearly expressing some hesitation, some concerns. Just one, and for explanation, if I look at the levels of disinformation, I don't want to flog this, but by far it's my more powerful predictor of how you're going to vote and where you are on issues today. Something that would have been absolutely untrue 5 years ago. The incidence of highly disinformed, the top category, is 5 times higher in young men than it is in young women. That's a massive difference. They're on YouTube every day with Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and Tate and all these guys, and they're not looking at any other. That group's lost. You're not gonna capture them. You don't have a media, you don't have a message. But young women, they're looking at. I don't know how date night looks like in Saturday in Canada today, but the gap between young Canada men and women is like never been larger. And it's not just trivial, it's profound, it's values-based, it's kind of stress level-based, it's a whole pile of massive differences. So I think the opportunity lies probably with young women, but you have to do better than, like I've had them running it from single digits to 14 points with under 35 Canada. You cannot form government or even think about it with numbers like that.
And the challenge there is really reaching them more than anything else, right? Like on media consumption, you ask people, where do you get your news from? Among boomers, 70% still get their news from TV. Even Gen X, that's the number one source. But you got down to millennials, and getting the news from TV is it's social media. You've got half them getting their news and information from social media, which is hard to control. And maybe you can reach them. Liberals are trying, I know, with podcasts and other measures, but it's just a harder message to communicate to people because of they're not relying on traditional media at all to get their information. Yeah,
they should go on the more popular podcasts, don't you think?
You have a lot of Gen Z women listening here, David.
Listen, guys, this has been fantastic. I could carry on forever, but we try to keep these podcasts to around an hour. So we'll have to do this again. But this was really fascinating. Thanks for illuminating all this.
A lot of fun. Thanks very much. Great to see you guys. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Yeah. Good to see you, Dan. Thanks. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN Rail, and thank all of you people who watched or listened. And let's give a shout out to Frank and Dan for spending an hour with us today. We'll see you next week with more of the Herle Burly. Take care.
Herle Burly. Herle Burly.